Hello and welcome to the MBOM podcast, where you'll learn to master the business of yoga. MBOM is a proud part of the Wander Barn Podcast Network, and I'm your host, Amanda Kingsmith. I'm a 500-hour registered yoga teacher, a yoga business coach, and a total business geek. Here at MBOM, you'll learn everything you need to know to create a sustainable yoga business by learning from myself and guests from around the world about how they built their yoga businesses, and about how you too can become a successful yoga teacher, studio owner, and much more. All right, let's dive in. Hello, everyone, and welcome back to another episode of Mastering the Business of Yoga. As always, I am super excited and grateful that you are listening here today. And I'm really excited for today's episode because I have an awesome guest for you. Today on the show, we are joined by Leya Van Doren. She's a creativity coach, a fellow podcast host, a seeker, and a collector of stories and seashells, which I absolutely love. She hosts creativity workshops to help creatives nurture their inner artist, break free of their creative blocks, and be in community and connection. And she also talks a lot about all of that on her podcast, the Creative Soul Podcast. She also has a background and whatnot with yoga. So we'll talk a little bit about her yoga story and how she brings, what she's learned from yoga into her work as a creativity coach, and talk about how we can bring that to our businesses. So very excited to dive in. And Leya, welcome to the show.
Thank you, Amanda. So happy to be here.
Yeah. And where are you joining us from today?
So I actually just moved to Michigan in February. So I've lived here a couple months now. I was previously living on the East Coast of the United States and between New York and Connecticut.
Nice. Awesome. Well, I hope you're enjoying Michigan so far, and hopefully it's more spring than winter at this point.
Yeah, now it's full on summer. We skipped spring. Spring was 1 week, and now it's just full on summer. So I've been enjoying that.
Awesome. I love it. And so maybe we can start with just a little bit about your background, your story. I know you have a kind of a deep, rich background with yoga. Can you share a little bit about your yoga story?
Yes, I love talking about my yoga story because I don't get to talk about it that often, but so when I was a teenager, I was 14 years old. My family and I were living in Pennsylvania at the time. That's where I was born and raised. And when I was 14 years old, my mom moved me and my siblings to an ashram in Northern California. So I don't know if your audience knows what an ashram is, but it's basically a community, a communal living situation and it was a Shivananda ashram. So they taught a lot of yoga and meditation. So that was really my first introduction to yoga, was living on this ashram. We lived there for 2 years, and they had a very intensive daily schedule where I think they would wake up at 5 a.m. Then you would go to satsang, which is meditation and chanting. Then they would have a 2-hour class, 2-hour yoga class, then breakfast. And then there would be karma yoga throughout the day and philosophy lectures, and then a yoga class in the evening, and then dinner, and then another satsang. So it was this very rigid schedule of yoga and learning about yoga philosophy. And so I was just a teenager living at this ashram. I was going to school at the time, so I wasn't fully participating in the daily schedule except for the yoga classes. So I would attend the yoga classes after school just as a way to move my body and to integrate with this community that I was living in now, which was a very new and unusual experience, especially for a teenager. But that was really what set the foundation for me to really learn the principles of Hinduism, of yogic philosophy, of yogic chants. I learned so many Hindu chants that I still know to this day. And it's so funny. But so that was kind of the start. And then that was back in 2009. And I remember yoga wasn't really this big thing in the States yet. It was a couple years before that big boom happened. And then it seemed like everyone was doing yoga, meaning the asana part of yoga. And so, because I remember at the ashram, I was embarrassed to tell my friends that I was practicing yoga because no one at school knew what yoga was. Nobody was doing yoga as a form of exercise or anything like that. So I remember a couple years after we were living at the ashram, yoga became kind of this bigger thing in the States and especially in California. And so I remember in college, I would continue my yoga practice because it was something that I had developed as a teenager that really did help me to be connected to my body and to my breath. And I also studied theater in school, in college. And so a lot of the I think theater and yoga can be really linked, because as an actor, you're learning how to use your breath in your body. And that's what you learn in yoga as well. So it's a nice supplemental practice to your theater practice. And so we would have certain classes in my theater school that were like adjacent to yoga. And so I kind of kept to my studies throughout college and just having my own practice. And yeah, I eventually then in 2019, I went to India to get my yoga teacher training. So it had been about 10 years of practice before I ended up getting my teacher training in 2019. And so I spent a month in India at another ashram, doing my 200-hour and kind of living and breathing and studying yoga in all her forms. So yeah, then after I returned from India, from getting my teacher training, I moved to New York City and then started to teach a couple yoga classes. And it was great. I was working at this studio and it was a lot of fun. But then the pandemic happened and everything moved online. And I was like, I don't actually think I'm so passionate about teaching like asana that I want to continue teaching online. But I found that getting my yoga teacher training really did translate to what I'm doing now, which is teaching these like mindfulness journaling workshops, these creativity workshops, which are in a sense a form of yoga, but instead of using asana, using meditation, seated meditation, and writing as a form of meditation to really access your inner voice and inner thoughts. And kind of a tool of self-discovery. So that's kind of my yoga journey, the short form version of my yoga journey. But yeah, lots going on there.
Yeah, no, for sure. I think it's so beautiful that it started so young too, and that you had that introduction and just, even if you weren't practicing all the time while going to school and college and stuff, you still had that sort of base there for everything that you were doing and living, which is so amazing. I think more teenagers need yoga in their lives for sure.
Totally.
And so I'm really curious about, where the kind of passion for like the creativity aspect came from. I know you said you went to school for theater. So obviously, being artistic, being creative is probably something you've been passionate about maybe your whole life. But can you tell me a little bit about kind of the journey with creativity?
Yeah, I love that. Yeah. So I also grew up in a family that was very creative, very artistically inclined. Both my parents were musicians. They taught piano and singing out of our own home. So they really encouraged a lot of like musical, creative abilities. And my dad, growing up, was actually the music director at a theater, at like a regional theater where we were living. And so I grew up on the stage and performing, and I loved it. I knew my whole life that was what I wanted to do. And so really for most of my life, theater was like this North Star dream of mine. I knew that I was meant to be on stage singing and dancing and acting, and I loved it so much. And like I said, I did go to college to study it. And once I graduated college, it was kind of that moment of, okay, now I have to make the dream a reality. Like I need, to be a working professional actor, at least in the States. The path usually looks like, moving to New York City, starting auditioning. And when you're auditioning in New York City, there's a whole lot of other people auditioning. And it's kind of like you're this tiny fish in a big sea. And there's lots of stories of people waking, trying to get seen at auditions because there's just not simply enough time to see everyone. And so you're kind of like subjected to this life where you have to wake up at like 4 a.m. to go stand in line just to be waiting in an audition to get seen. And then maybe you're in that room auditioning if you finally get in, and you can spend hours waiting for your time. Then you might be seen for about 30 seconds and then that's it. You might never hear back from them. Rejection is very common in that industry, which is something you just have to get used to, which like they prime you to get used to it. And then you might book the job. You probably won't. But if you do book the job, the pay tends to be very, very low. And so even though theater and performing and singing was such a huge passion of mine, I think once I graduated college and was really faced with the reality of that situation, I kind of had this moment with myself where I'm like, wait a second. I didn't just like study my whole life in the creative performing arts to wait in line. And I don't want to wait in line. And I don't want to have these gatekeepers telling me that I'm good enough or telling me, yes, that I'm good enough to be seen. And so I had to like go through a whole reckoning with that and really decided that maybe the traditional path of being an actor was not for me. And so I started to do a lot of rediscovering of my own creativity because I had always grown up so creative. But I think being in school, you're really channeling that creativity into something so specific that I think your innate creativity can get kind of lost because you're then surrounded by mentors and teachers telling you, what to do, how to look, what to wear, and how to kind of market yourself as a brand so that you can get cast in things. But that really disconnected me from my own innate creativity and disconnected me from those things that I just inherently loved, like singing songs that maybe I wouldn't usually sing for an audition, or painting or walking, or, all of these different things that do inspire my creative spirit. So once I graduated college, I went and I started working at a theater out in Connecticut, and I was working in their business office. So I wasn't doing anything particularly creative at that theater, but I was surrounded by creative people. And I really started to think like, how do I want to express my creativity? How can I get back to this feeling of creating just for me and not creating because I'm trying a character, not creating because I'm trying to get cast in a show, just creating for me and really rediscovering that. So I ended up writing a one-woman show that I ended up performing in New York City. So I ended up having this like beautiful performance experience that I totally created on my own. And it wasn't because someone else told me to do it. It wasn't because someone else said yes. It was simply because I wanted to tell my story. And so I did that in, I think, 2018, 2019. And then at the same time, I self-published a book of poetry because I realized that poetry was something that I always loved and had just been doing in journals whenever I had time. And I always had a dream of writing a book. And I was like, well, who's to tell me that I can't? So I just went ahead and self-published, and that's still on Amazon. It's called Mermaid Musings, Stories of Sea, Sex, and Spirituality. So those are the themes of my life and things that I love. So yeah, I ended up doing that. And that's what kind of catapulted me more deeper into this more spiritual journey of rediscovering yoga and kind of connecting back to my yogic practice, my meditation practice, and really realizing that spirituality and creativity are so inextricably linked, and that they are essentially the same practice. Because I think what I discovered was all of the principles that I had learned throughout my theater training were really the same principles that existed in a meditation practice. Things like, dropping into the present moment, things like listening and responding, things like making it about, there's this thing that they teach you in theater school about if you're in a scene with a character, you're making it about the other. So you're not like focused about yourself, you're focused on the other person and you're listening and responding to what they're doing. So I just found all of these parallels within spiritual teachings that I had learned from acting and from theater and from performing. And so that's what led me to quit my job, go to India to do my yoga teacher training, and then really discover this passion for wanting to teach people these spiritual and creative lessons through any creative act. So that could be writing, that could be singing, that could be dancing, that could be walking, that could be painting, whatever the medium of expression is, it doesn't really matter. As long as you're kind of dropping into the present moment and getting into that state of flow, I think that's a meditation practice in and of itself. And I love sharing that practice with others because I think we have this narrative in society that only, the talented people get to be creative, or, only certain people are creative. Only if you're born with a gift that you're able to be creative, and not everyone is creative. But that's so untrue because every human being is creative. Every moment is a creative act in and of itself. Just the simple act of breathing is a creative act. And so I love reminding people of that simple truth that we are all creative beings. We all get to create each moment however we want to create it. And just really developing this beautiful relationship with the divine and listening to your creative urges and your creative ideas, because if you're getting that creative idea and creative urge, that means that something wants to be birthed through you. So that's really important to listen to and to not get bogged down with all of the fluff and stuff that society puts on us of, well, it has to look a certain way, or we have to be good enough or talented enough, or, my voice is not worthy of being heard. All of these kind of things that we have to work through. But yeah, when we can really listen to that creative voice and express that and share it with others, I think that is such a beautiful gift to be had, to be given, to be received. And I think the world just can use a lot more of that.
Yeah, I love everything you just shared. And before I lose my train of thought, I want to just say, like, the fact that you did a one woman performance and self-publish your own poetry book is so badass. So that's so awesome. I love just the approach of, like, I could ask permission from a publisher, or I could ask permission to do this or see if somebody else will do this. But, I'm in charge of my life and I'm in charge of my creativity. This is fueling me. I want to do this, and just taking action on that. And I think that that's just a beautiful reminder for all of us. And then the other thing I wanted to touch on was just this idea of, I think that, like you said, sometimes we get it in our heads, like, oh, I'm not good enough at this, or I don't do it well enough, or I'm never going to make money off of this. I feel like that's a big story for me. Society kind of tells us, like, oh, if we're not making money off of it, or it's not a part of our business, or it's not like fueling our career in X direction, it's not worth our time. And I think that that's like totally false information, because giving our body, our mind, our spirit time and space to just be creative is a really beautiful gateway for us coming up with more ideas for our business or that type of thing. So I'm wondering if you can talk about, I know you listed a few different ways you can be creative, but maybe for somebody who's like really lost touch with this, like through, maybe going to college and pursuing a professional direction, they've lost touch with, like, oh yeah, I used to like finger paint when I was a kid, and I didn't, care about how it turned out. And I wasn't trying to create an Etsy store to sell it. And I wasn't, worried about getting my fingers dirty, et cetera, et cetera. So what are some ways that we can, like, be creative in our personal lives?
Yeah, I love that. And I'm so glad you touched on the money aspect of it too, because I think that's something that we all have to navigate in our own ways of, right. Do we have to monetize all of our passions and hobbies? Can something just be a hobby and something that we love to do? And so I'm really glad you brought that piece into it. Maybe we can talk more about that later. But yeah, for anyone who's looking to reconnect with their creativity, I think the first thing that comes to mind is really connecting back to what did you love to do as a child, and just exploring that for a bit. So maybe you could either do a meditation to connect with your inner child, or you could even just walk outside and connect with nature and just spend some time in reflection of what did you love to do as a child, and maybe where did that get lost along the way. And I think that too, we have to redefine what is determined as something creative. Because I think so many people can have such different ideas about that. Like, okay, what does being creative look like to me? To me, being creative, I know that feeling of like being in flow and having ideas and doing something that fills up my cup. And that might look like journaling. That might look like going for a walk outside. That might look like cooking in my kitchen. That might look like listening to music and dancing around. Like, that is enough. That is a creative act. Even I was in the wintertime, it was really cold here in Michigan, and I was taking a lot of baths. And baths became my like creative spiritual practice, because drawing a bath and putting different scents into it and putting the salt in it, like that became a creative process, because I was making something, and sitting in the bath, being alone with my thoughts, opened up so many creative thoughts and processing that in itself became a creative act. So it truly doesn't have to look like anything. It's kind of just that feeling that you get inside of being in flow and feeling really good, and maybe making something with your hands, engaging your body in some way. I think that's a big piece of creativity, is embodying an aspect of yourself and embodying creativity. So that could be some movement practice. I think yoga is such a creative act. I think anything that uses your whole body, like surfing or swimming or biking, whatever that is, that can kind of connect you with your innate creative spirit. So yeah, if I love to give people like prompts where they do lists. So if you're having trouble kind of thinking up something, you could just make a list. you could write down a question. This is something I teach in my workshops, but the process is you write down a question and then you have 30 seconds to list out 10 things. So you can't really overthink. You just kind of have to write the first thing that comes to mind. So a question could be, what did you love to do as a child? Another question could be, if you had all the time in the world, what would you do? How would you fill that time? And more often than not, some of those answers to those questions come from that place that maybe we haven't been spending enough time with. We have been repressing a little bit, but maybe something that you always wanted to do if you had all the time in the world was read books about the stars or read books about fireflies, or maybe you want to read more about dragonflies. Like these things that, like you said, maybe have zero connection to our business or our work or how we're spending our time, but really can open up so many pathways to different ideas and to looking at things in different ways. And I think what's so cool about creativity and also just the spiritual journey is that everything connects, everything connects. And there's this juxtaposition that I like to say with the creative process, everything makes sense. And also everything doesn't make sense. And you don't even know the things that connect or the things that might connect later, or the things that connect now, or the thing, a thread that you pulled from years ago might suddenly have some relevance now. And maybe it doesn't. And that's okay. It's all about creating for the sake of creating, just to be in that flow, to be in that communion with the divine, and to be in that spirit of creativity, which feels good, and it's supposed to feel good. And so those are just like a couple ideas of people, if they really have been disconnected from the creativity for a long time, just spending that time in some reflection, maybe doing some journaling, asking yourself some questions, doing some self-inquiry, and seeing where that leads you, and just having fun with it, and like being open to the surprise and magic of it, because we can't plan where it's going to take us. We can only open ourselves up to the journey of it and see where those paths may lead.
Hey, yoga teacher, we're just taking a quick break from the show to talk about online courses. When it comes to courses, there are so many different ways you can go about it. You could create a step-by-step video course that teaches students about a specific skill or specialization. You could sell or rent on-demand videos, repurposing your online classes, or you could decide to bundle your courses or classes with a membership instead of selling them as standalone items. Every yoga business is different, but if you want to start offering courses or some sort of on-demand video content, I highly recommend using Offering Tree. First of all, you'll have complete control of who gets your content, including who can see it and who can download it. You also get unlimited video uploads, and you can offer content as part of a membership, charge one-time fees, or use sliding scale pricing. Drip content out over time, offer limited access rentals, sell recordings, and more. I could seriously go on, and the possibilities really are endless. And that's just one reason why I love Offering Tree. I could talk for hours about all the things that I love about this platform, but I'll just say that it's really a one-stop shop for your yoga business. So if you've been looking for a software platform that is easy to use and affordable, you can stop looking, because Offering Tree is it. And because you listen to MBOM, you'll get a special discount. Head on over to offeringtree.com/MBOM for 15% off an annual plan or 50% off 3 months. And don't forget that everyone gets a 14-day free trial, so you can try it out, play around with no commitment. All right, so head on over to offeringtree.com/MBOM. All right, now back to the episode. Amazing. Yeah. Thanks for sharing that. I love those tips. So that's really great. And then kind of heading into that, what we were talking about with that money aspect. So I think one thing that can be challenging sometimes is like, okay, I could, spend time kind of indulging my creativity, or I could like work on my business, or I could take another yoga class, and that stuff, gets me paid. And obviously girls got to eat. And especially in today's current like economic climate, things are expensive. Life is really expensive, especially if you live in countries like Canada and the US. Life is very expensive, especially if you're working for yourself. So I'm curious, like, do you have any tips for somebody who's like, yeah, I really want to tune into this, but I have troubles like justifying that this is how I should spend my time, or any tips for like scheduling this into our week and making sure we're actually doing it? Because I think sometimes we can just be like, yeah, like I really want to like paint. I'm going to paint sometime this week. And then it's like the whole week goes by and you haven't done it. And then you're a bit disappointed in yourself, get in that cycle.
Totally. Yeah, I can totally relate to that. As I think most of us can, because we, at least in the States and many parts of the West, we do live in this very capitalistic society, and we are all part of this system where we do have to support ourselves, and whatever way we can do that, whatever way we make that work for ourselves, there's just a lot that we have to do, and not only just work, but even making food for yourself and, moving your body and all of the other life things that has to be taken care of. I mean, just being a human is really hard and overwhelming at times. So the first thing that I want to say is that, I think that there are so many moments throughout the day where we can infuse creativity into the things that we're already doing. And so what I mean by that is, if you do have to cook yourself a meal, that is a creative act. And you may not have been looking at that as a creative act. And maybe you don't even like to cook, but even just, coming back to like the present moment, coming back to your breath. I really do believe that creativity is that pathway into presence. And that's really all it's doing, is bringing us into a deeper state of presence with ourselves and our intuition. And so the way that you're moving about the world already, if you wake up in the morning and you go for a walk or you meditate, like, how can you connect with your innate creative spirit in that way? So coming back to your breath, really being intentional with how you are moving throughout the world, instead of being in this unconscious state, doing things kind of as routine or as rote, really coming back to the newness and the aliveness of every moment, of every situation. So if you are making a meal, how can you just infuse your creative spirit into that? And whatever that looks like to you, maybe it's just the way that you spread butter on toast. That could be a creative act. So kind of rethinking these things that you're already doing, how can you connect back to that moment of flow and getting in there? And then also, like you said, spending time to, if you want to write, spending time to write, or if you want to paint or things like that, you want to get into those modes of expression. It can be really hard to fit that in our day. So I think less is more, even spending 5 minutes doing something creative. If you have a 5-minute lull in your day, and instead of picking up your phone to go on social media, you can set up a paint thing. I just got into painting, and I have like all these paints on my floor, so that when I have 5 minutes of my day and I kind of need a little break, instead of picking up my phone to scroll, I'm like, you know what, I'm going to paint a little bit. I have this like paint by number thing. So I'm like, I'm going to do a couple of things in my paint by number. And that is that like mindless, mindful activity that I think what we're looking for when we reach for our phones, or we, are kind of trying to distract ourselves from our day. I think that can be a really beautiful way to infuse that mindfulness and creativity into your day. And then if you have, just finding those like 5-minute pockets wherever you can. Maybe it's just sitting down and writing for 5 minutes, something I'm sure maybe some of your audience have heard of The Artist's Way by Julia Cameron, but her practices in The Artist's Way, one of them is something called the morning pages. And the morning pages are essentially every morning you wake up and you write down 3 pages of stream of consciousness journaling. And that's a beautiful practice to do, but maybe not everyone has time to wake up and write 3 pages of journaling. But how can you do like a 5-minute brain dump throughout the day? If, your brain is full of thoughts and you need to kind of get something out, you can sit down and just write for 5 minutes, free flow, get it out. And I find, and people that do this practice find that you feel so much calmer, you feel so much more at peace, you feel so much more centered and so much more grounded. So it really can be such a centering, grounded practice, just as we would in our yoga and meditation practice. So it's kind of finding all those things and really making it work for yourself, and not putting pressure on your creativity, because I think that's what can trip us up, or what can block us eventually, putting this pressure on ourselves that we have to show up in a certain way. But showing up as you already are, showing up, meeting the moment where it's already at, and coming at it from that place, knowing that you already are creative simply by breathing and living and existing. And when you want to follow some more of those passions or those creative urges, just following it and doing it for a couple minutes and seeing how that feels. And then maybe incorporating that more into your day or your week or your weekend, to spend more time doing things that make you feel good and really get you into that grounded, more centered place.
Amazing. Yeah, I love all of that. Thanks for sharing those tips. And I think it kind of makes me think about how, I guess sometimes I think, oh, I'm not spending that much time on creativity. I'm constantly in my head about like, oh, well, if I worked an hour, I would make, X amount of money, or I could do this for my business versus like doing something that doesn't have that like tangible dollar amount to it. Yet I think that as you were talking, I was like, oh, I actually am doing quite a bit of, creative moments in my day. And I think just being more conscious of that and giving myself credit for that is really important. And then something I wanted to say, my husband just sent me an email yesterday. I can't remember who it was from or whatever, but it was kind of talking about this idea of like, we always, especially in our like, capitalistic society, we put dollar amounts on like, hey, I'm teaching a yoga class. This is worth like $50. That's what I'm making, blah, blah, blah. And we don't always think about like the value of other things in our life. And it was talking about, the value of a partner. And I think it was like this person had put like, oh, your relationship with your partner is worth like $100,000. And, connecting with a neighbor, like knowing a neighbor in your community is like $60,000 or something like that. And it's just kind of this reminder that like, yes, obviously having the actual physical, tangible dollar amounts come in is important because you can't pay your rent with like, hey, I've got this great partner that's worth a lot. Like, let me mortgage out their arm type thing. But it's also, we also have to think about like the value of things that I guess we're not just necessarily receiving this direct exchange of money in. And I think that especially when it comes to like, I think yoga teachers are inherently creative entrepreneurs. And when it comes to running a yoga business, I think that giving ourselves time and space to be more creative is, something that has sort of this like intangible dollar amount that in turn helps our business thrive.
Totally. And I think that's so important to remember because even if, you want to maximize your time and you want to, if you spend X amount of time, you can make this amount of money, but you have to also remember that everything you do creates ripple effect and ripple impact in your life. And so even spending that 5 minutes writing or 5 minutes painting, that might not seem like much. And yet that will create such a ripple effect on your business. It will maybe open up new ideas of new income streams or open up new ways of doing things. And really what it's doing is connecting you back to your authentic spirit, your authentic soul, and connecting back to your intuition, which is what we hope a yoga or meditation practice might do for us. So connecting back to your authenticity and what you want to express and who you really are, I think getting in touch with that is so invaluable. Then it might, our society might not deem it as productive to spend 5 minutes or an hour painting versus an hour of sending out emails. But the ripple effect that can have on your life can be like insurmountable. So I think it's important to remember that everything you do matters. The way that you approach every moment matters. The way that you infuse your intention and your creativity into each moment matters. And so whether or not you're sending emails or painting, it all matters. It's all impacting your life. It's all impacting your business. So it's all productive. I mean, I think there's a lot of conversations going on right now about productivity and rest and the fact that we really do not honor our cycles as humans, especially in this capitalistic society. And something I've been thinking about a lot, I heard this like on a podcast recently, but it's this idea that when we look at nature, nature goes through its cycles and through its seasons. And the only thing in nature that's constantly producing, constantly hustling, constantly creating, constantly growing is cancer. And so when we compare ourselves to nature and we are nature, we look at the way that we've been living, even just the 9-to-5 lifestyle. It's like, I cannot show up every day 9 to 5 because I am a cyclical being, especially as a woman. We go through these such important cycles every month that we can't show up the same way. So I think honoring our cycles and resting when we need to rest, knowing that rest is just as productive as working, and rest is as important for our creativity than producing something or launching something or putting something together. Like you can't have one without the other. And you're going to have those periods of inspiration and motivation and wanting to get things done. And then you're also going to have those periods of not wanting to do anything, not having any inspiration, not having any motivation. And that doesn't mean that anything's wrong with you. Doesn't mean that you have to fix something. It just means that you're a human being. And like nature, we have our seasons of fallowness. We have our seasons of winter. We have our seasons of rest. And so important, remembering that too, and just giving ourselves all the grace right now, especially because I think we're all really tired and exhausted, and as much as we can rest while also still living within that system of needing to show up 9 to 5 or needing to show up to make money for our business. It's a really hard thing to navigate, and I think we're all navigating that now as we're kind of feeling, I don't know, just kind of this burnout maybe from the last 2 years. But remembering that the more that you can give that to yourself, the better off you'll be in all areas of your life.
Yeah, no, I love that. I did a podcast episode a couple of weeks ago, I guess more a couple of months ago by the time this is released and live, just about rest and setting boundaries and the importance of it. And I think that, like on the podcast, we talk a lot about, how to make more money and fill your classes. But I think that goes hand in hand, like you said, with resting more and listening to our body and following the cycles. And I feel like that's just become more and more and more important to me as, I've just progressed with my business and my personal life and stuff like that. And so one thing I wanted to talk about is, how being a yoga teacher is a creative act. And I know you mentioned this earlier, how yoga is kind of innately creative when it comes to the meditation, the breath work, and even like the way we can physically move our body and whatnot. But maybe we can dive a little bit more into that.
Yeah, I love that. I think, because that's something, maybe if you are a yoga teacher, maybe you didn't necessarily consider yourself a creative, but I think it's such a creative act because, like we said, connecting to our body, connecting to our breath is inherently creative, but also, putting together a sequence and putting together a class is a creative project in and of itself. It's a creative process. And I'm sure, people listening, they probably have their own specific process for how they put together a class, not, all the preparation before a class. So it's like before the class even starts, you'd have to maybe plan out the sequence. And then when you show up in the class, how do you invite people into the room? What do you say? What kind of movements are you going to take people through? Are you going to share, a quote or a poem or something, something that relates to the theme of the class or anything like that? All of those things are so creative, and to be able to take that, shape it, and then share it is a creative process and a creative gift in and of itself. And so changing our mindsets a little bit to really understand this as a creative process. And how do you show up differently when you think of it as a creative process rather than something that you have to do, something that you have to get done, something that, is just on your day that you do every week or every day or whatever that is, coming back to that joy and that excitement of this is creative. This gets to look like however you want to look. And you get to then share it with an audience. You get to share this practice with others, which is such a beautiful gift to give. And even in that room, if you're in person and your voice is sharing cues and taking people into poses, those people receiving that, like that, it's all so creative. So really coming back to just that truth of what you are really giving. So I think, like when we can approach it from that creative lens, I think it becomes so much more fun and so much more enjoyable, especially if you have lost that spark and kind of been overwhelmed or burnt out with teaching. But to really come back of it as like, how can you make this exciting and creative for you? And what is that gift that you want to share with others, and kind of approaching it from that lens. So we can talk more about that, but that's kind of what's coming to mind right now.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, I really love that. And I think that it is interesting because I think that there's probably some yoga teachers out there listening who have identified as creatives and know that what they do is a creative act, but maybe others who hadn't thought of it the same as like maybe painting or creating music or singing or something like that. Because I think they often, in society get put in sort of different categories. Like when you think of, hey, I'm an artist, it's like not usually, like a yoga teacher is not usually listed, right? Yet it's like we are creating this experience and this form of art through the sequence we're doing and the theme we're creating and the words we're using and maybe the music you're playing. I just recently did an episode with how to use how music can be powerful in your classes and how it can really create that experience. And I think as a yoga teacher, you are kind of like setting the stage, setting the mood, setting the vibe for people. And that's like certainly a creative experience. So yeah, I definitely love that. And I think, yeah, maybe we can dive a bit deeper into this, like how to be more creative as a yoga teacher, how to start kind of channeling that creativity for anyone who's maybe feeling like they've lost that, or they've lost touch with it, or they'd never really considered this perspective, that type of thing.
Yeah, I love what you said about it. You're creating an experience for people, because that's exactly what it is. You're creating, even like you said with the music, which I had, kind of forgotten about, but it's true, even selecting the music and really setting that feel and that tone and that vibe. And you're giving someone that experience to then feel something, experience something, and you're able to infuse your intention in it and allow them to take what they need and leave what they don't, which I think happens anytime we share our creativity with others. And so, yeah, for people who have not really thought about it as a creative act, like how can you connect deeper into that creative sense of it? I think what comes to mind is really letting yourself play. And so instead of, thinking that it has to be this, and this, and I have to get this right and this right and this right, how can we come back to that spirit of play? And maybe, even as a yoga teacher, maybe you initially approached your practice as a form of play, as a form of connecting deeper with yourself. And I know that through life and when you're teaching something and doing it so regularly, you can kind of lose that sense and that spirit of play. And so what I would suggest is just to roll out your mat, and instead of having any preconceived notion or idea of what you're going to do or what you're going to create, just allow yourself to move and allow yourself to play and see what arises from that practice of play. So maybe you set a timer for 10 minutes, 15 minutes, 20 minutes, however long, and your sole intention is to play, and see what comes out of that. And I think when you approach it from that sense, then your creative spirit can really shine through. What wants to be birthed through you, what wants to be shared by you, can come out of that practice of play. And even if you finish, you also have to recognize that you might have thoughts when you're doing this of like, oh, this is stupid. Is this worth my time? Like all of those thoughts that we kind of discussed, is this really going to help me? How is this going to help my practice? Recognize that those thoughts, if they come up, they're part of the process. And so instead of, shoving them away or feeling down about yourself, just inviting them into the practice. So how can you then move and transmute those feelings and emotions of this isn't worth my time to really connect with that sense of play? So what I would do is, set out my yoga mat, maybe put a song on that you love, and just see where that takes you throughout the length of that song, and see if anything new arises. And if nothing new arises, if you didn't discover anything through that, fine. Like that's perfectly fine too. Letting it be what it wants to be. So I think that really, when we talk about creativity and when we talk about like, how do we let our authentic spirit kind of rise to the surface, it's really accepting that everything is part of the process and that there's no way to do it wrong. So allowing yourself just to play, to kind of get your hands in there and letting it go, letting it be whatever it wants to be. You're not the one deciding that it has to be this, this, and this. You're the one opening up the channel to allow that spirit to move through you in whatever way it wants to. And, when you reach the end of that practice or the end of that journey, what are you left with? And just noticing and observing that and seeing if that wants to spark into something new, or if that didn't work for you and you want to try something new tomorrow. Like those are, I think, the principles that we have to remember, that just to kind of get out of our own way, to be able to play without feeling like this has to be so good, or, this something has to come out of this, but just allowing it to be what it is and letting that be okay and letting that be enough.
Mm-hmm. Beautiful. Thanks for sharing that. And it was just making me think about, I have like a really, I guess, like solid routine sort of morning or evening practice, depending on my baby's schedule, now that I've got a little one to take care of. But people would be like, oh, you practice yoga? And I'm like, well, it's like probably not like the yoga you're imagining. Like, I feel like it's just like intuitive movement, like exactly what you're talking about, where I just put music on. I've got like a morning playlist. So it's often, the same song. And I just kind of connect to my breath and connect to my body. And I'm like, what does my body need in this moment? And I've got, 15, 20 minutes where I can just do whatever. And sometimes it's like 5 minutes of rolling my feet out on a massage ball. And sometimes it's like mostly Shavasana. And other times it's like more dynamic and more, I'm moving quite a bit into my body depending on what I'm feeling. And I feel like that's been such like a beautiful thing to have in my day. And I guess I would say that is my yoga practice. But I think if somebody was to watch it, they would be like, you did like a low lunge and a forward fold. Like that's the only like traditional, yoga poses, quote unquote, that I actually do. Like I'm not doing Ashtanga or some sort of sequence. It's just letting my body kind of lead and guide me. And I really love having that.
Yeah, I love that you shared that, because I think that we can really kind of get into these labels of like, right, are we doing the whole sun salutation sequence? Are we doing all of this? But that's enough for you. And that's enough for right now. And yoga, we can talk about like, in the 8 limbs of yoga, asana is just one small part of that. And so connecting with your breath, being in that flow, like that can be the intention of yoga. And so that's okay. It doesn't have to look like anyone else's practice.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, for sure. I love that. It's a beautiful reminder for myself and everyone listening. And so we've talked about so much good stuff, Leya. I could just keep you here all day, but I want to get ready to wrap up. And one of the things I always love to ask people near the end of the show is just what sort of like business lessons have you learned through your journey, your career?
Oh, that's such a good question. It's an ever evolving journey. I think, everything I think in life is a mirror, and, whatever situation, whatever way that we're channeling that into, whether that's work, whether that's business, entrepreneurship, creativity, family, relationships, it's all just a mirror back to ourselves and a mirror on, what did we come here to work on in this lifetime? What did we come here to learn? What did we come here to transmute and transform? And so for me, my business journey has been such a reclaiming of this idea of I am good enough, and like I have nothing to prove. I think I've been doing a lot of work recently around like childhood trauma and going to therapy and a lot of stuff, and realizing that I did have these inherent beliefs that were picked up throughout my life of, needing to prove something. So I think when I started out my entrepreneurship journey, I was trying to do everything at once. And especially as a creative person, like I mentioned, I wrote a one-woman show and published a poetry book all in a year, which is amazing. But I think it really came from this need to prove myself, to prove that I did have something to offer, to prove that I did have something to share. And so throughout the past couple of years, and as I've allowed my business to evolve, and also, I'm not a full-time entrepreneur. I still have a 9-to-5 job, and I've had to deal with a lot of I think shame around that, the fact that I'm not a full-time entrepreneur yet, or I'm not totally self-employed, or, that would have been my dream, but it's just not possible for me right now. And all of these kinds of stories. But I have to come back to that truth of it's a journey, and it doesn't have to look like anyone else's. Again, I think that's the theme that's been kind of coming up as we've been talking of, your path is your path, and it's going to evolve as you evolve. And there's no point in comparing it to someone else's path, because you came here to learn your lessons. You came here to learn what is true for you and what's resonant for you. And so I think I'm coming back to that truth again and again of, if I am already inherently worthy, and if I have nothing to prove, it kind of creates this blank slate in my life of like, well, then what do I actually want to do? Because I think a lot of the things that I was doing kind of came from this place of wanting to share and wanting to inspire, but also that little twinge of, well, maybe I'm doing this because I want to prove something, or because I want to show that I'm worthy. But if that already is truth in this moment, then I can kind of sit back and relax and do nothing. And do nothing meaning show up without having to prove something, without having this like, I have to get this and then I have to get that. It's like, no, I already have everything I need. And what does it look like when I meet life from that place? And I'm kind of at the beginning of that journey where I feel like I'm allowing myself more to sink into that. And it feels at first it feels confusing because I think it's so different than anything we've been taught. But when you kind of sink back deeper into that truth, it's like, I don't have to do anything. And I can kind of just allow myself to float on this river of life and see where it leads me and be excited by the turns that it takes and be open to the surprises and knowing that like me being here is already enough and there's nothing else I have to do. So I think that's kind of the question that I've really been exploring right now, especially as I have all these ideas for my business and want to implement them. But it just, life has been telling me that it's not the time. And the time right now is to really just be with myself and to sit with myself. And that's okay. That doesn't mean that I'm any less worthy than someone who's making money from their own business or doing all these other things or, whatever that looks like. It's like, it's okay if this is what it looks like. And yeah, so just really being okay with that and kind of surrendering to that journey is something that I've really learned.
Yeah. Thank you so much for sharing that. That's just so like resonant to me. And I think I'm sure other people listening, and I just appreciate you sharing that so authentically, because I'm sure that's near and dear to you. But I think it is a beautiful reminder that, the world likes to should on us and society likes to tell us what we should be doing. And I think that there's no one right path for people. And I think that really tuning into that is so important and figuring out, what's right for you in the moment. And if it's quitting your job and going all in on your business, that's beautiful. If it's working a full-time job so that you can pay your rent and you can eat and you can have those securities and working on your business on the side, that's beautiful too. And if it's like, hey, I'm kind of just dabbling with this and I really need to take time and space for myself, I think that's also really beautiful. And there's, a million other variations of that in between all of those. And I think that just tuning into that and trusting that is so important because it's so easy to get in your head with that stuff, like crazy easy.
Totally. Yeah. Trust, I think, is such an important piece of it, of letting go and trusting, because it all comes back around and it all connects. Like we said, everything connects.
Yeah. Amazing. Thank you for that. I've just, like I said before, I loved everything we've talked about today. This has been such an amazing, amazing conversation. Leya, can you share where people can go to find you, listen to your show, all that good stuff?
Yes. So the best place is Instagram. I'm at Leya Van Doren, my name, LeyaVanDoren. And then my website's also leyavandoren.com. And then my podcast is the Creative Soul Podcast, which Amanda was also on. So definitely check out that episode. And yeah, that's on all the podcast streaming platforms. So yeah, I always love connecting with people. And so if anyone wants to reach out and just send a message and say hi, that lights me up. I think connecting and just creating community is really, what matters in life. And so, yeah, if something was resonant, I would love to just start a conversation and love connecting with people.
Awesome. Sounds great. Thank you so much for your time today, Leya.
Yeah. Thank you, Amanda. This was awesome.
Thank you so much for tuning in for this episode of the podcast. To find links, notes, resources, and everything mentioned in today and all episodes of the show, you can head on over to mbomeyoga.com. You can find the podcast and myself on Facebook and social media at Mastering the Business of Yoga. And I would love for you to join the private Facebook community, Yoga Business Badasses. If you have any questions, comments, or feedback, please make sure you reach out to me at info@mbomeyoga.com. And last of all, if you enjoyed this episode of the show, please make sure you hit subscribe and leave a review for the podcast. It would mean the world. Thanks so much for listening, and I'll see you next week. Namaste.